Welcome to Dr. Will's History Road Trip. On this edition of Dr. Will's History Road Trip, we're going to discuss another historical presidential election. Now, the elections we've discussed so far have mostly been 19th century elections. I think we've done one 20th century, 1912, and that's very early 20th century. And mostly that's because I'm a 19th century historian, and that's where I'm the most comfortable. But for this one, I want to discuss a very important 20th century election, the election of 1948. This was one of the biggest upsets in the history of presidential elections, particularly in the era of polling. All the polls got this one wrong, so that ought to sound familiar to you. To understand why this race was so close, we need a little context. The incumbent president going into the election of 1948 was Harry S. Truman of Missouri. Now, Harry Truman had a very ordinary background. He'd grown up on a farm in Missouri. He had served in World War I without much distinction. I mean, he had a fine war record, just wasn't anything, he wasn't Sergeant York or anything like that. He got into politics through the Kansas City machine, Democratic machine, and he was a very loyal Democratic Party operative. He served the party loyally for many years. That's why in 1944 he was nominated for vice president and won. So he becomes the vice president in January of 1945. Of course, FDR was the president. FDR had already served 3 terms, so Truman would be the vice president for his 4th term. And then in April of 1945, just 3 months after inauguration, FDR died. And here we had somebody the country hardly knew as president. Really, Harry Truman wasn't very well known outside of Missouri. Now, Truman actually turned out to be a better president than anybody expected. So it just goes to show how lucky this country can be at times. People didn't have very big expectations from him, but he had them of himself. He's the guy that had the sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." In other words, I'm the guy in charge. I'll take all the responsibility. And he handled his job very well. Now, in terms of domestic policy, what Truman wanted to do was to continue the direction of the New Deal, which was FDR's domestic legislative agenda. Essentially what the New Deal did was, just in broad general terms, it meant using the national government as an agency of reform. The national government does things like protect economic stability, promote economic security, help those in need who can't help themselves, things like that. He wasn't able to get a whole lot accomplished at finishing FDR's 4th term, but there were a few things. One of the more important things that Harry Truman was able to get accomplished finishing FDR's term was something called the President's Committee on Civil Rights. This was an executive committee that he started, and the purpose of this was to look into the issue of civil rights in this country, particularly in the South. The New Deal hadn't done a whole lot about civil rights, mainly because Southern Democrats were very opposed to it. But Truman was interested in civil rights, and he creates this committee in 1946. This was the first committee of its kind since Reconstruction. It's the first time since Reconstruction that the federal government said, you know what, we may have a problem in terms of race relations in this country. This may be something we need to look at correcting. What this committee did was it studied race relations in the South, the Jim Crow laws and all that, and it created a committee, the committee created a report called To Secure These Rights. And they began publicizing the need for changes in this country in terms of civil rights. And that makes sense. When you think you have a problem, the first thing you have to do is investigate it and see what the problem is. Then you make changes. Now, think about this with me for a second. Why do you think, I just told you a minute ago that we had not had a committee of this kind on the federal level since Reconstruction. Reconstruction ended in 1877. So you go almost, you go 70 years, and the federal government doesn't look into civil rights at all. They just they figure the South can do their Jim Crow thing. That's the business of those states. Why do you think all of a sudden in 1946 we start looking into it? Well, think about this. What we just got finished doing in 1946, we just got done fighting World War II, had we not? And who have we been fighting? Well, the Japanese and the Nazis. And did the Nazis have a race problem? Yeah. Does it not look a little bit hypocritical to hold ourselves out as the saviors of humanity, and we're fighting these evil racist Nazis, but then we don't have a great record on the way we treat our black folks, at least in the South? So that's one reason. The biggest reason that becomes an issue is because by 1946 there's a new enemy on the horizon. It's no longer the Nazis, it's the Soviet Union. We're now involved in the Cold War fighting global communism. And the Soviets, in their propaganda, were able to use our racial issues against us. They were able to go to third world countries and say, hey, don't trust the United States. They talk a big game about freedom and equality, but look how they treat their black people. And they were able to say, here in the Soviet Union, we treat everybody equal, which to a point is true. They treated everybody equally crappy. It's not a system you'd want to live under, but they were able to use that as propaganda. And so the reason we start looking into the issue of civil rights after World War II is because we don't want the Soviets to use that against us as a propaganda tool, okay? And I believe President Truman was genuinely interested in the issue anyway. So you see this. And then in addition to this, you see Truman act in other ways that he could act on his own as president. In 1948, he desegregated the U.S. Army. The Army had been segregated all the way up through this point. So we start to see a shift in public opinion on civil rights after World War II. Now, politically, that presents a problem for Truman, since he's a Democrat and a big chunk of his party's base are Southern Democrats, and they were opposed to any changes in the Jim Crow system that they had run since the 1890s. Okay? So Truman's able to get a little bit accomplished in the area of civil rights. He's not able to get a whole lot else accomplished because he's facing some pretty massive domestic problems in 1945 and 1946. Think about it. What kind of economy had we been running all during the war years? A wartime economy, right? We're out there producing planes, tanks, war material, that kind of thing. One of the problems Truman had in 45 and 46 is a problem called reconversion. That means what we have to do is bring the soldiers back home and reconvert to a peacetime economy. Well, think about the problems that this is going to cause. During World War II, while the men went off to fight, many factory jobs went to women, and they stepped up and worked these factory jobs and kept the country running and produced war material. Well, now the men are coming home, they're going to want their jobs back, right? And there's not enough jobs to go around. And that's going to be a bit of a problem because we're scaling back production. Heavy industry doesn't need to make planes and tanks and bombs and such anymore. Also, we had a problem with inflation. When our economy reconverted to a peacetime economy, people who had made a lot of money during the war weren't able to spend it that much. Remember, there was rationing going on during the war, so if you wanted to go out and buy a car, that didn't make a lot of sense because there was a gasoline ration and you couldn't put a whole lot of gas in your car and things like that. Everything went to the war effort while World War II was going on. So there were some people who had made money during the war, they weren't able to spend it. Now the war's over, those rationing restrictions and other restrictions are lifted, you can go out and spend money. Well, think about this. If everybody and their grandma starts spending money at the same time, what does that do to prices? Now, this is basic 12th grade economics. It shoots prices right up, right? Skyrockets them. That's inflation, which means you've got massive inflation going on at the same time. You've got massive unemployment because you've got all these soldiers coming home that don't have a job. So we got pretty wild inflation. A lot of money, relatively few goods. I think in 1946, the inflation rate was somewhere in the neighborhood of 30%, which is bad. And that inflation rate was really hard on working people. And what happened during the war, and this you saw a similar thing in World War II, is that labor unions in this country had generally supported the war effort, meaning they didn't go on strike during the war because that would stop production. That'd be detrimental to the war effort. So what they'd find is that their wages had fallen behind during the war. After the war, they want to catch back up. Well, if you're management, you're trying to scale back production. You're not going to want to raise wages at the same time. So what you had is a tremendous number of strikes in 1946. Probably more strikes in 1946 than in any other year since 1919, which was one of the worst years for labor strikes. Probably the best example was the railroad workers threatened to go on strike in 1946. Now, even today, it would be bad for our economy for all railroads to come to a stop. In 1946, that's catastrophic. That's going to shut the economy down. And this threat was so potentially devastating that Truman threatened the railroad workers. He said, if you guys strike, I'm going to make sure you're all drafted into the military, because we still had an active draft. Well, guess what? They didn't go on strike. But the bottom line is, politically, who's going to be hurt by this? Harry Truman and the Democrats, because they're the party that's been in power since 1933. So in 1946, you have midterm elections, and you know what midterm elections are. The president's elected every 4 years, House of Representatives every 2, senators every 6. So in between presidential elections, you'll have what's called a midterm election, where everybody in the House is up for election and 1/3 of the senators. Okay, and in this midterm election, the Republicans had a lot going for them. Their campaign slogan was "Had enough," and that was it. It's 2 words of the question mark. Had enough, and you don't have to say the rest of it, because everybody knew. Had enough of what? Everybody knew labor problems, inflation, etc., etc. This was very successful, and the Republicans won control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1930. Okay? The leader of this new Republican Congress was a senator from Ohio named Robert Taft. Does that last name sound familiar? It should. His father was president, William Howard Taft. And this new Republican Congress passed some pretty important legislation. One of the measures that they passed was something called the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. And of course, this is a law that Senator Taft had a hand in writing. And what this act was intended to do is reduce the power of organized labor. One of the things that the Taft-Hartley Act did was to outlaw what was called the closed shop. Closed shop laws were laws in various states that meant you had to belong to a union to get a job. You couldn't even be hired unless you were a union member. And this outlawed that. They said that's not fair. Now, it permitted something called the union shop, which meant you don't have to belong to a union to get a job, but once you get the job, then you have to belong. They let states pass union shop laws, but then they also allowed states to pass things called right to work laws. Right to work was a law that you could pass as a state that basically said you don't have to ever be a member of a union to get a job. You've got the right to work regardless of your membership in any sort of collective bargaining agreement. Okay. Now, here's politically, and for our purposes in this video, this is why Taft-Hartley is important. It passed Congress, and it goes to Truman's desk, and he vetoed it, okay? But Congress had enough votes to pass it over his veto. They were able to override his veto. Now, in order to override a presidential veto, you have to have 2/3 of both houses of Congress vote for a bill. And that's what happened. They passed Taft-Hartley, Truman vetoed it, they passed it again and overrode his veto with 2/3. Okay. Another thing the Republican Congress did was they reduced taxes. What they did was to give a 20% flat tax reduction to anybody who made less than $320,000 a year. Okay. Now, tax reduction, generally a good thing. Well, Truman vetoed this as well. Can you imagine a president actually vetoing a tax reduction bill? I mean, is that political suicide or what? Well, Congress overrode this veto as well, and they passed tax reduction. The last act they passed in 1947 that was really important was bipartisan. Both parties supported it. It was called the National Security Act of 1947. And just as a broad generalization, what that act did was update and modernized our defense military establishment. That basically is where we get the defense establishment we have today. The Department of Defense, Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, all that stuff comes out of the National Security Act. Well, after what we just talked about, then you would think that Truman would be in a lot of trouble going into his re-election campaign in 1948. And in a lot of ways he was. Republicans had taken over Congress, so he's got a hostile party in Congress, both houses. They had overridden his veto twice. The Cold War was starting to develop, and the Democrats had been in power, so everything that went wrong in the Cold War got blamed on them. And then on top of this, to make matters worse, Truman's own party was divided. They were divided in a number of ways. The most spectacular way in which they were divided was over the issue of civil rights in the South. This is sort of started during the New Deal when Southern Democrats started to buck FDR on a few things. but it really got worse at the Democratic National Convention in 1948. During that convention, a young Democratic senator from Minnesota named Hubert Humphrey, who would later be the vice president, called for an endorsement of all sorts of civil rights legislation. And in this speech, he made a very famous statement where he said, quote, "It is time to get out of the shadow of states' rights and stand in the light of human rights," end quote. Well, that made Southern Democrats so mad they got up and walked out of the convention. They're gone. And they're going to form a third party that they call the States' Rights Party. Now, everybody called them the Dixiecrats because that's essentially who they are. They're Southern Democrats. They nominated for president Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina. So Truman faces that challenge from the more conservative elements, the more right side of his party. He's also going to face a serious challenge from the left wing of his party as well, when former Vice President Henry Wallace ran as the candidate of the Progressive Party. Now, don't confuse Henry Wallace's Progressive Party with Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Progressive Party back in 1912. Wallace had been vice president under FDR in his third term. He was an important FDR advisor. He was very left-wing, not liked by moderate and conservative Democrats, which is why he got bumped off the ticket for Truman in 1944, and I believe he probably still held a little bit of a grudge about that, okay? So the Democrats are divided. They're really split three ways in this election. You've got Truman running the Democrat Party, then you've got Southern Democrats going and nominating Strom Thurmond for president under the States' Rights Party or Dixiecrats. Now you've got Henry Wallace with his taking left-wing Democrats and forming the Progressive Party. The Republicans were not divided. Their candidate was a man named Thomas Dewey, the governor of New York. Now, Dewey had made a name for himself as a district attorney in New York back in the 1930s when he went after the mafia. And he actually succeeded in prosecuting some pretty high-profile mafiosos like Lucky Luciano. He had run against FDR in 1944 and lost, but no Republican was going to beat FDR while he was still alive. He did do better than the three previous GOP candidates did against FDR, though. Now, when the Republicans had their primary, he was challenged for the nomination by Robert Taft, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. Robert Taft was much more conservative than Dewey. Dewey was very moderate. Taft kind of led the conservative wing of the party. But Dewey had enough support to fend off that challenge from Taft, and Thomas Dewey winds up getting the nomination. Now, everybody and their grandma thought that Dewey was going to win this race easily due to the three-way split in the Democratic Party. Dewey's campaign was so sure he was going to win that they urged him to play it safe and not do or say anything that might alienate voters. So he doesn't really take a stand on a lot of issues. He doesn't go after Truman on a lot of issues. And his speeches were full of pablum and inoffensive platitudes like, now this is an actual quote from a Dewey speech, quote, "You know that your future is still ahead of you," end quote. Well, yeah, of course you know that. Where else would your future be? The only person in America, it seemed, that didn't think Dewey would win was Truman. Truman crisscrossed the country on trains, giving speeches, lambasting congressional Republicans. He labeled the 80th Congress, which was the one controlled by Republicans, as the Do-Nothing Congress. And that name stuck. Now, that's a purely political name because they weren't a Do-Nothing Congress. They'd done lots of things. They were just things he didn't like. But that name stuck, and crowds responded enthusiastically to Truman at his speeches. Every time he would be giving a speech and he laid into Congress, crowds would yell, "Give him hell, Harry," and that became a nickname for Truman. His nickname was "Give him hell, Harry Truman." Okay? Well, election night was interesting. Truman won 303 electoral votes to Dewey's 189 and Strom Thurmond's 39. I don't think Wallace got any electoral votes. The Republican-leaning Chicago Daily Tribune was so sure on Election Day that Truman would lose and Dewey would win that they went ahead and ran this banner on Tuesday night for the Wednesday morning edition. Wednesday night, Truman's giving a speech, and somebody handed him a copy of the paper, and he smiles, holds it up, and says, "That ain't the way I heard it." Okay. So this election was significant for a number of reasons. For one thing, this was the fifth election in a row the Democrats had won. That's a record that was second only to the Republican run between 1860 and 1880 when they won 6 elections in a row. And that's the last time that happened. Since 1948, the most one party has ever won has been 3 elections in a row, and that was the Republicans between 1980 and 1988. Reagan won twice, and then Bush in 1988. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Dr. Will's History Road Trip. We got some pretty exciting episodes coming up, some on-location episodes coming up, so I hope you'll pay attention to any updates, and I'll see you guys on the road. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Dr. Will's History Road Trip. If you like what I'm doing and want to continue following, please subscribe to my channel and click the notification button so you'll get updates when I post new content. Also, please consider supporting me via PayPal, Venmo, or CashApp. Your support will enable me to go to interesting places and film them and talk about them with you. Feel free to suggest locations that you might like to see me visit in the comments below. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the road.